Well, hello. It is so good to see you all here. Thank you for braving the wet and the misty weather just to be with us in real life, which is, or as we now like to say, IRL, the shorthand of these last 2 years of Zoom life. I've been dreaming of this day for too many months to count, of just seeing you all, and I just want to say, you look marvelous. Every single solitary one of you, you look marvelous. Thank you. It is such a pleasure to welcome you to our first Murrow Society gathering of 2022 and to see City Space full again. Thank you for kicking off your slippers and peeling off your sweats to be here with us tonight. And a special hello to our many friends who are here with us virtually. While so much has been so hard, there are ways that we've really transformed the way we understand what's possible, discovered new ways to be together, and we're delighted that the now familiar technology magic has allowed us and you to be part of tonight's gathering. We actually feel your presence, even though you're on Zoom and not in the room. WBUR's Morrow Society members, you have a very special place in our lives and our hearts. While so many people told us that they couldn't have gotten through the last 2 years without us, that we were their lifeline, the truth is we could not have gotten through the last 2 years without you. You are the wind at our backs. I love how imaginative our listeners are. I suspect many of you participated in our Valentines Day campaign earlier this month, sending flowers to your loved ones and at the same time helping to fuel WBUR's journalism. So I thought I'd share with you some of the notes people sent along with their dozen long-stemmed roses. I cannot wait to tell you just how much you are loved. Always your NPR Valentine. All told, 4,000 people expressed their true love for their sweethearts, for NPR and BUR in ways that were both heartwarming and occasionally hilarious. I love you and National Public Radio, but you more. Most of the time. This was my favorite. Roses are red, Hallmark cards are Goyish, celebrating V-Day again and supporting Rupa Shenoyish. I'm happy to report that Rupa Shenoy, our Morning Edition host, loved that one too. The reason that I'm sharing these notes is because they capture the relationship we have with one another, the depth of our connection, how embedded we are in your lives and you in ours. It was 40 years ago tomorrow that I first walked through the doors of NPR as an overnight production assistant on Morning Edition, and I was hooked. I have devoted my entire life to journalism and to public radio. And thank you. And I'm a hometown girl. I grew up just a few miles from here, and I am so proud to be leading one of the city's most beloved and trusted institutions. My parents, if they were still with us, would be proud too. They were fiercely devoted WBUR fans. My sister always tells me, she reassures me, she says, Mark, I know they know that you're home and why you're here. 2 years ago, I stepped onto this City Space stage for the first time, and none of us could have imagined the next 2 years and what it would bring. The experience galvanized us. It tested our mettle. It revealed how much our work matters. We're all here because we believe that WBUR is indispensable, a public good. And local news has relevance and importance that it's never had before, whether we're talking about climate change, the pandemic, race, or income inequality. These are issues of seismic, national, and global importance. And they're also profoundly local and have a direct impact on all of our lives right now, where we are and where we live. And at the same time, we face threats to the very foundation of our democracy that make an informed public crucial to our future well-being, to our survival. And I believe this actually gives us an opportunity, requires us really, to extend our relevance through first-class reporting and storytelling to Boston and beyond. It's an opportunity, it's a purpose we embrace, one that comes at an especially difficult time. this most critical moment in my memory. The challenge to democracy comes at a moment when journalism is imperiled, not just by the upending of facts, which we all know so well, but because of serious economic and technical disruption. Media advertising, which once made up nearly half of our revenue, has been in steady decline. And the technology needs of a modern media company have increased exponentially. We've watched over the last decade as newspaper journalism has been diminished, or in some cases disappeared altogether from cities and towns across the country. Many brilliant thinkers are asking the question, what happens in a democracy when local journalism disappears? This is a crisis of a different order of magnitude, and your support has never, ever been more important. Despite the complexity of this moment, we see a path forward. We're continuing to invest in the quality of our journalism, and with your help, we've created editorial teams and focused on the environment, education, arts and culture, and investigations. WBUR now has City Space, this beautiful venue where we can bring people together to grapple with the most consequential issues of our time, just like we will tonight, and to marvel at the brilliance of our city. This is where we introduce the Artery 25 artists of color transforming the cultural landscape, artists who stand out for the work they're creating, whether it's on a stage or on a canvas or on a plate. And at the same time, our dogged investigative reporters spent months on a story about civil asset forfeiture, a term that we all learned with their reporting. They revealed that Massachusetts police can easily seize your money. In fact, one top prosecutor makes it nearly impossible to get it back. He's been stockpiling people's money for years, even when those people were never charged with a crime. A reporting produced in partnership with ProPublica, which is the gold standard of investigative reporting, prompted Massachusetts lawmakers and criminal justice advocates to call for changes to the laws that govern that practice. The range and depth of our reporting is really what defines us. We took you tap dancing in a Cambridge park, finding joy in the middle of COVID. Introduce you to Boston moms overwhelmed by COVID, screaming at the top of their lungs on a frozen football field. That story went viral. We got to know 2 Afghan families in the cinderblock cellar of an old Episcopal church in Newburyport, 2 sets of parents and 15 children. They escaped their homeland when the Americans pulled out and when the Taliban took over. Last summer, they're among 2,000 evacuees resettled in Massachusetts, and that turns out to be twice the number that Massachusetts expected. And then there's climate change, one of the most pressing issues that we face. And this spring, WBUR will launch a newsletter to help New Englanders understand the enormous environmental and social impact of what we eat. Advice, tips, recipes, and sustainability lessons to help us all eat to save the planet. We are not just radio. We are WBUR. We are a public good and will always be free. Essential for anyone and everyone who want to make the world a better place. And now we are shaping an ambitious picture of our future, our shared future. We're putting the finishing touches on a strategic transformation plan. We're on the right course, but it's going to take time, and we need the trust and commitment of you, our community. We also need critical runway. Our goal is to serve ever more people in ever more meaningful ways. We must widen the circle, reach more people, reflect every neighborhood and town across this magnificent corner of the country. We want to be a melting spot, the point of connection for different generations, different cultures, different opinions, and we must make our coverage more essential so that more people cannot imagine a day without WBUR. And we're building an organization that reflects the communities we serve. I would say, and I suspect that you agree, that Boston is arguably one of the smartest cities in the country, where ideas and exploration are part of the fabric of our lives. And I believe that WBUR helps thinking people think harder. When we embark on a story, we ask ourselves, what are the deeper implications of what we're reporting? What will people learn? What will they feel? And what will they remember? What will you feel? And what will you remember? Our job is not to just report the news, but to provide comfort and connection to an expanding circle of people, to hold those in power to account, make sense of a complicated world, illuminate ideas, foster understanding, build community, and as often as possible, spark joy and laughter. WBUR has been on the air for 70 years. Our other job is to ensure that we're here for another 70 years, at least. And with journalism's fragile economics, that's not guaranteed. If we don't want our voices extinguished, this is a moment that demands the very best of all of us. It's a big job. It's the ultimate responsibility to make sure that WBUR is here and soars for a long time to come. And we are so grateful for your belief in the work we do and for your enduring generosity. So, in appreciation of your unwavering support, I am delighted to introduce tonight's lineup to talk about the dangerous situation unfolding in Eastern Europe and here at home. Scott Tong will lead our conversation. Scott is co-host of Here and Now. That's our midday news magazine, which we produce in collaboration with WBUR. Before Scott joined us last summer, Scott was a correspondent for Marketplace's sustainability desk. He covered energy, the environment, and global economy. Before that, he opened Marketplace's first China bureau. He was Shanghai bureau chief. Scott has reported for more than a dozen countries, from refugee camps in East Africa to shoe factories in Eastern China. His book, A Village with My Name, takes a personal, generational look at winners and losers of globalization. His grandmother had her feet unbound in early 20th century China and was educated by American missionaries. His grandfather died as a political prisoner in the Chinese Gulag. I have spent many, many hours with Scott Tong, but this is the first time we're actually in the same room together in real life. And what a delight it is. We are so lucky. Scott, we are so lucky to have you. And then Heather Cox Richardson. She teaches American history at Boston College. She's written an impressive number of books and started a magazine of American history for general readers called We're History. And almost 2.5 years ago, she started writing a daily newsletter that now lands in many of our inboxes every morning. It's called Letters from an American, about the history behind today's politics. And much to her surprise, the newsletter struck a mighty chord, and she has become something of a Substack superstar. We're thrilled, Heather, we're so thrilled to have you here. Thank you. And, wow, Fiona Hill. Fiona Hill is one of Washington's foremost experts on Russian President Vladimir Putin. She's served in multiple U.S. administrations as an intelligence officer and policy advisor, most recently as senior director for Europe and Russia on the National Security Council under President Trump. She is now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and co-author of the book, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. I can't imagine a better guest for tonight. Talk about timing. Fiona Hill. Scott, take it away.
Oh, Margaret, thank you, and thanks to all of you for turning out this evening. So as we speak, the President of the United States is putting in place sanctions against Russia and Vladimir Putin. The European Union has done the same thing. The President is responding to what he calls the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And today, Vladimir Putin urged Ukraine to accept that Crimea belongs to Russia and to ditch its plans to join NATO. And we all watched to see if sanctions cut off the financing and transport of Russian oil and natural gas. Oil prices are up, markets are down, and all of you turned out for a couple historians. What's up with that? Well, because we have two of the very best who can help us take a long view of what's happening right now. So what I'd like to do is we'll have an informal conversation. We've been doing that in the green room in the back, and we'll chat about, at the start, a little bit about what's happening in Ukraine and to get Heather and Fiona's observations. And then I want to talk about Fiona's story. You lay it out in your new book, There Is Nothing for You Here. And it goes into, well, it goes into your life and your career, leading all the way up to your testifying in the impeachment trial. So we'll talk about that. And you all are going to join us as well. So The instructions for you to submit your questions electronically are for you to go to the website Slido, and I'm checking with Stephen, who's there, slido.com? slido.com. The magic is here. Stephen is here. So go to slido.com and type in Murrow, all lowercase, Murrow. You know how that's spelled. Okay, so let's talk about Ukraine first of all. President Biden has, let's talk about the concept of invasion. I mean, he has described this as the beginning of invasion. So maybe starting with you, Fiona, what is the argument that yes, this is an invasion, and what's the argument that no, it's actually not?
Well, it's very hard to say that it's not, because in fact, this is the third time around that Russia has invaded Ukraine. So if we cast ourselves back to 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, which it's now basically saying that Ukraine has to accept is formally part of Russia, so de jure rather than de facto, because in March of 2014, Vladimir Putin had a major speech, not dissimilar from some of the speeches that he's made recently and the essays that he's written, basically declaring that Crimea was basically essential Russian territory, historically Russian, that had been wrested away by an accident of history during the Soviet period when it was transferred administratively from the Russian Federation to Ukraine. And then, in that immediate aftermath of the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the sparking off a war in the eastern regions of Ukraine and the Donbass, the historic old coal mining area of Ukraine.
And those are the regions in the news today.
That's right. And basically, a secessionist movement led by purported militias who were opposed to Ukraine, and we've had a conflict that's been going on there for the last basically 7 or 8 years, with almost 14,000 people being killed. So this is really just the next phase. And in fact, the Russian government and tried to go much further in 2014. I'm sure Heather and you and many others will remember this, and seeing if they could spark off similar uprisings and militia activity outside of the areas that were today declared as recognised independent, or yesterday, I guess, by the Russian government. It's hard to keep track of time because things are moving so fast at the moment. And trying to basically move all the way down to the Black Sea coast, as far as Odessa, the famous Black Sea port that also Russia thinks is an intrinsic part of their history, and that didn't work. So there wasn't a mass uprising in these major cities as well, and the Russians pulled back. But in these declarations of independence, all of the commentary that we're getting out of Vladimir Putin and others, there's some sort of dark hints that this isn't where they're stopping. That basically the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk includes the entire administrative borders, and the line of contact, basically in the conflict between Ukrainian forces and these rebel groups from Donetsk and Luhansk, is well inside the administrative borders. So I think this is, again, just sort of setting the scene for more action.
Okay. And
this is why history becomes important, because if you
right.
Putin is basically saying this is all about history. It's the historical justification,
and that's why Finland's so worried.
That's right. Many other countries are worried as well.
Right, and I do want to ask you about Putin's kind of worldview on history. But first, as far as technology, I'm going to ask Stephen if he can close his mic. I don't really like the sound of my voice anyway, but I'm hearing it twice now. But let's talk about Putin's worldview. And Heather, please chime in as well. I mean, what are we learning in this moment about Putin, how he strategizes, and how he looks at history?
Well, one of the things that Putin's been taking on, and this is really in Heather's arena, is this kind of idea of Russian exceptionalism. And in a way, he is pushing back on the idea of American exceptionalism. And there's also kind of a justification of this act as might makes right. And I'm sure that what we're going to find as we move along in this conflict, as we've already heard from Putin and others around the Kremlin, is the justification for what Russia's done because of things that we've done in the past, in the United States, for example. So, well, what about your invasion of Iraq in 2003? Not mentioning Iraq in 1990, when, of course, we were part of an international coalition to push back against Saddam Hussein, doing exactly, in fact, what Putin is doing right now when they moved into Kuwait. So what Putin is doing is actually a rerun of the first Iraq war, when Saddam Hussein seized Kuwait, basically saying that Kuwait was an accident of history, wasn't really a country, and actually Kuwait and all of its oil fields belonged to Iraq. It was just when the Brits and the French were drawing maps, they drew things in the wrong place. And that's basically what Putin is saying now, is that, again, accident of history, Ukraine is part of this patrimony, the imperium of Russia, that the Russian kingdom, the Tsardom, the whole of the Russian Empire began in Kiev, one of the ancient sort of cities of the medieval era. There is basically a long historic justification for the act that he's taking now, and a lot of it is also to do with what the United States is perceived to have done. So in December of 2021, on the 17th, I'm sure many of you have been following this because NPR has been covering it really extraordinarily well. The Russian government submitted two documents to the United States and to NATO with 3 demands. One, that NATO should cease and desist any kind of consideration of Ukraine being part of NATO. So it also goes back to the sort of history of the post-Cold War when we expanded NATO and whether this was the right thing to do and what was promised to Russia. But certainly from Russia's view that Ukraine and other former Soviet republics like Georgia and even the Baltic states, which are members now of NATO, should not have been admitted, and Ukraine and Georgia should certainly not be. Then that NATO should pull back from any deployments of forces and infrastructure to 1997, so before all of the expansion of NATO began, and just as Russia and the United States signed an agreement that would give Russia a special relationship, the Russians hoped, with NATO, and that the United States itself should pull back from Europe. So there's all of this kind of packaged in together, and and it gets back to, again, this idea that the United States also always declares itself as exceptional. We give ourselves the rights to do all kinds of things. Well, that's just what Russia's doing.
Can I ask, why do people say that Putin is trying to recreate an imperial Russia as opposed to a Cold War Russia?
Well, it's really about the territory. Because what Putin is doing is looking back to kind of the gathering of the Russian lands back to imperial Russian times. So it's not the Soviet Union per se, because a lot of these territories Putin is talking about extend much further than even the borders of the Soviet Union. So he's been invoking, for example, in some of the commentary, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And one of my former history professors from my university in St Andrews wrote me a note today saying it all goes back to the Treaty of Andrusovo. And this is Jeffrey Parker, who is a professor at Ohio State now, 1660s, when basically Ukraine, the lands of modern Ukraine were divided up, and Russia took Kiev. And Putin's made a point. He told George W. Bush that, George, Ukraine isn't a real country. Part of it was in Eastern Europe, and the other part was given to us. And my professor was suggesting that, this was the ultimate time when Kiev and part of Ukraine were given to Russia. So Putin is picking his historical point and basically moving from there. And that was in the early stages of the empire. But Peter the Great, who comes along after the 1660s, has a major battle on Ukrainian territory with the King of Sweden, Charles XII, in a place called Poltava in 1709, which is also considered to be the starting point of the Russian Empire. So basically, Putin's messing around in earlier periods of history. And when he annexes Crimea in March of 2018, he talks about a different period in history. And Catherine the Great, who we all know was a German princess, so who kind of came along and sort of took over in the Russian Empire, and that he's basically following, back to the history of Catherine the Great's annexation of Crimea, which is in the 1700s. So it's kind of all of these later periods after Peter the Great.
So I don't want to.
So it's just all really complicated, basically.
So
It is,
picking
but
and
now
choosing.
you have
He's
your.
picking and choosing, exactly right. And it's,
You have your
very,
references
even as a
for your
historian
cocktail
who's been
party.
studying Russia, it's making my head, okay, which treaty is this? I think he's spent COVID in basically the basement of the Kremlin getting out all the old treaties.
You heard it here.
Yeah, I think that's what he's been doing.
I don't want to go that far back, but you mentioned
Yeah, I don't either.
1997. So I'm going to go back as far as 1997. We read a quote on Here and Now about a quote that goes something like this in 1997. The expansion of NATO would be one of the biggest American foreign policy mistakes. Sounds like Vladimir Putin, right? It was George Kennan.
Yeah, it was George Kennan, yeah.
Right? It was the famous American diplomat, the architect of American Cold War strategy, and what he said had been echoed by others. Right? Kissinger said this, and Pat Moynihan in the Senate, he was considered an intellectual in the chamber, and he said that too. And the point of that was the framing that I want to ask you about is NATO, from Russia's perspective, has been creeping ever since the Berlin Wall fell. And then the property of East Berlin that became absorbed into a unified Germany. Suddenly, the NATO line started moving eastward. And it goes back to that. So from Putin's perspective, or maybe more interestingly, from the Russian people's perspective, is that the narrative, that NATO has had this geographic mission creep, and now it's here.
Well, one of the things we have to remember about NATO is that it's an alliance of mutual consent, and countries normally apply to join. So in the depiction of NATO, but there is one difference here that I'm going to mention here, because I think there's a different point where we do move away from that kind of essence of this. But basically, it's not that there's a kind of a NATO headquarters where there's someone, the Secretary General, sitting around thinking, I'm going to expand. It's basically countries are applying. But there was very much the sense that at the end of the Cold War, because the NATO alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, had been set up to counter the Soviet Union and the Eastern Soviet bloc under the Warsaw Treaty Organization during the Cold War, that it would probably fade away when the war ended. And, like most institutions, doesn't really fade away.
Yeah.
A lot of people felt that there was a lot of vested interest. This is actually, it wasn't just that it had resisted the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but that there was all of these practices of working together. And so, NATO was looking for another mission. I mean, we're all familiar with that, right? Kind of the way that everything looks around for a kind of a second or a third act. And when all the agreements were made with the Soviet Union, there was just the first agreements that NATO would not expand were during the reunification of Germany in 1990, and the Soviet Union was still together. And I think, even if you look ahead into the 1990s, there wasn't kind of a conception that all of these countries would actually want to join NATO. And in the 90s, we'd set up an alternate organisation, the Partnership for Peace, which actually I wish it was still around, because there was a lot of engagement between NATO countries, NATO members, and the countries of the former Soviet Union and the former Eastern Bloc, including Russia, in that framework. And many people who are now asked about this, actually look back on that period and wish that we'd kept that in place for an awful lot longer. Because then what happened is that countries started to want to join NATO because they became worried about a resurgent Russia, the Baltic states, Poland. First of all, it was Poland, the Czech Republic after Czechoslovakia split apart, and Hungary. And then there was kind of a cascading effect. And, this is, from the Russian perspective, was the expansion of NATO, and very worried about why other countries wanting to join. And there are a couple of points that changed the Russian view of NATO. One is in 1999, so it's after 1997, and the founding act for the Russia-NATO Council. It's when it's a NATO mission to bomb Belgrade during the Balkan Wars and, of course, all the ethnic cleansing that was going on in Kosovo. And Putin was the head of the FSB, the successor organization to the KGB at that point. I happened to be in St. Petersburg in Russia during the bombing of Belgrade, and at a big conference in a room like this with Russians from all kinds of different backgrounds, and there was just a uniform alarm, even from those who'd been somewhat well disposed towards the United States. Suddenly, this was NATO, the military alliance. If they could bomb Belgrade, they could bomb us. And so there's a real shift then. So NATO is still a military alliance. It's not this club of values looking for another mission. if they're doing this to the Yugoslavs, to Belgrade, which was part of the Eastern Bloc, they could do this to us over a conflict. This was over the conflict in Kosovo. Then, fast forward to the other Iraq war, not the 1990, but 2003, where we make the very fateful decision on the back of pretty faulty intelligence to go into Iraq. That becomes a NATO mission. And the Russians, see that as well, that you have NATO coalition forces, and then, later, earlier also with Afghanistan after 9/11. And so the Russians start to see all of this. And from the view of the Kremlin, the old Cold War paranoia and fears come back, and then they start to see, after this, after intervention in Iraq, the expansion of NATO in 2004 to the Baltic states and to other parts of Eastern Europe. And for Putin, this becomes kind of a pivotal moment. And then the period is 2008, when we basically offer Ukraine and Georgia the promise to be in NATO. But although they've applied, this is the first time we've actually said to any would-be applicant, you will be in NATO. So this is a kind of a sudden shift. This was actually a blunder in terms of it shifts the whole perspective on NATO, and especially from the Russians' perspective. So there's a kind of accumulation of all of these issues. From the Russian perspective, going back to what Kenan said, clearly this had a very negative effect on Russia, the expansion of NATO even by application. But if you're a Pole or a Balt or a Czech, you would feel very differently, and obviously wanting to push and to apply. But it's really the Georgia-Ukraine push to join, and NATO actually saying that you will be a member of NATO, but not setting up a kind of an application process in 2008 that becomes really a tipping point.
So would you pick up what he has just said, though, that do you think it was a mistake to expand NATO in the 90s?
Well, I did at the time, but I was not, didn't have much of a prominent position. I was basically a graduate student, and working on my PhD. My professor at the time, my thesis advisor at Harvard, Richard Pipes, also thought it was a mistake. No friend of the Soviet Union. And for the same reasons as Kenan and many others, worrying about how that would be perceived by the Russians. But this is again in the 1990s. I mean, I finished off my PhD in 1998, so before we moved ahead on this. So even some of the more conservative scholars, or at least had these reputations, and those who were not well disposed to the Soviet Union, felt that this was an error in a post-war environment. But again, and Richard Pipes was originally from Poland. It's kind of later though, Poles and Balts and others, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians worrying about their own sort of security and wanting to apply was really the push. And then people recalculating. There's an extremely good book by Mary Elise Sarotti, Not 1 Inch, which actually recounts all of this. It just came out a few months ago, and I think I'd recommend it to people to see the kind of blow by blow of that period.
Heather, can I ask you about the sanctions part of today's news?
Sorry. She's really interesting.
I know. No.
I can try to bring her in.
I'm happy. You can read me every night.
No.
Often do you hear from Hill?
I have read you writing about the Congress and sanctions, and the EU announced sanctions before President Biden announced sanctions. Congress, however, has been talking for a while about trying to come up with significant sanctions, and in the end, they couldn't. What does that, I guess, tell you about the role of Congress or the role of partisanship in this moment?
Okay, so I actually have an answer to that I'm going to throw back to you.
Yeah.
So one of the things that has fascinated me about President Biden is the degree to which it seems to me, from a domestic perspective, because I don't do foreign affairs really at all, is the degree to which he has switched the nature of our engagement with the world to focus on cybersecurity and on money. So the Biden administration has focused on money since the very beginning. If you can follow treasury.gov, which doesn't update as fast as whitehouse.gov or state.gov, but if you're interested, it's worth reading them every single day because that's really where the nitty-gritty happens. So it doesn't really surprise me that and Biden has turned towards sanctions not only for Russia, but also, for example, for drug dealers in Latin America. There's been a huge shift there as well. There's actually a list you can read every day, which may not be all that exciting, but it's sort of interesting to watch.
No, Heather reads it, so we don't have to.
But well, it's interesting how much is actually available to look at. But so there has been, first of all, that switch, and it's something that the Biden administration is focused on really strongly in a way that Congress, of course, has its own partisanship issues going on right now. But to throw it back to what's going on now, I wonder the degree to which that expansion of NATO, or rather the open door of NATO, because it wasn't a deliberate attempt to expand, beginning in the 90s, changed the ideology of both world affairs but also domestic affairs, in the sense that now that there is this expansion of Russia into especially Ukraine, but also Belarus, which I'd love to hear you talk more about as well. There is much more of talk, certainly coming from the Biden administration, coming from Secretary of State Antony Blinken, about democracy, about how what's at stake is democracy versus oligarchy. And I know, of course, that NATO was formed in the 40s in order to press back against the idea of communism. But that language of we are now democracies standing against the spread of authoritarianism, is that post the 1997 introduction of all these new countries with the idea that everybody should be able to determine their own alliances? I mean, what you hear now is that what Putin is really afraid of is not NATO, it's democracy. Is there a change in idea, a world, well, maybe not world ideology, but certainly the way Americans frame international affairs?
I think there's been a sort of an evolution of us framing. I was listening, very carefully to, what you were saying there, because I was sort of trying to, as we all probably do, casting our minds back to the 1990s. There was sort of an idea then that, partly the expansion of NATO was related to this, the idea of sort of expanding this concept of a Europe free, whole, and at peace. I'm not quite sure how well we've done at all of that. But this whole idea of expanding democracy, I mean, I'm sure there was some events, back in the day at WBUR, where you might have had people talk about the third wave of democracy. Remember, we had Francis Fukuyama talking about the end of history, that democracy was going to break out all over. And it wasn't just the multi-party system and the representative government, but it was also, all intertwined with that idea of the expansion of the free market and rule of law. Now, where we got kind of lost was the rule of law.
Right.
Because if you look around and I have to say, let's come back to here as well, just to be very clear. When you look around what started to happen in Eastern Europe and what we thought were going to be the new democracies, we all used to talk about transition economics. I took a lot of courses on that, back in graduate school. And what did we transition to? I also used to work at the Kennedy School at Harvard for a project called Strengthening Democratic Institutions in the 90s. And I came to fear that we just strengthened autocratic institutions by the end of it, because we focused again on the nuts and bolts of creating political parties. And almost in the political machines, we'd take people to New Hampshire and Iowa, we'd take them to meet the various political teams that would kind of run people for election.
You took people from the Baltics?
From Russia and the former Soviet...
To Iowa and New Hampshire?
Exactly, and this is explaining everything, right? Exactly. We talked about how the kind of our politics worked. Well, that ended up leaving to the growth in Russia of political technologies. They figured out this is how you manipulated the political system. That's where you get the managed democracy, because we didn't show them the grassroots politics. And the people like all of you going, door to door and taking part in political campaigns, or the mass participation. It was all about the kind of the surface of politics and how the political campaigns operated. And I look back on that in the 90s with quite a bit of regret on that about what were we really imparting here. And then also, as I said, in the transition and the rule of law, Richard Pipes, my professor, started writing about this history of private property. Russia didn't have a history of private property in the past, and the boyars and the aristocrats, the landed gentry of Russia, it wasn't their land. It was basically given to them because of their service to the Tsar, and the Tsar could take it away. So there wasn't really private property per se. And if you look at the emergence of the kind of the oligarchical business class in Russia today, it's very similar. They're kind of the asset managers, the stewards. They've been given some of the prime assets through privatization. All the people who really did the best out of privatization in Russia and all of the other former Soviet states and often in the Eastern Bloc were the people who were tied into the original government. The Minister of Energy might become the head of one of the major oil companies or people who worked in those ministries, for example. And the ordinary people who got vouchers to basically partake in privatization found that middlemen would come in and consolidate all of these and expropriate them. Even people who got their apartments, if there was a great desirable place, they literally might be bumped off or basically expropriated. And so there was all this kind of consolidation, and we didn't basically institute the rule of law in private property or in the sort of transparency of governance, the good governance, all the things that we talk about today of ESG, of environment and social responsibility and good governance in corporations. We missed all of that in the Russian context. Just quickly on the democracy side of things, what we were missing was this transparency in the system. And over time, we've become more corrupt as well. And that becomes part of our problem now, because what Putin is doing is fighting for the right to keep everything pretty corrupt, following the money, so that he can manipulate things. And all of the people that we can think of, not just Gerhard Schroeder, the former Chancellor of Germany, that they've put on boards or brought into their various corporations working alongside oligarchs, is part of the problem. And Treasury and others are now doing a rearguard action trying to address that.
Let me jump in with two quick questions from the audience on what we're talking about, and then we want to get to your new book. From Richard Cowett, given how positive former President Trump was toward Vladimir Putin, why did Putin not make his move while Trump was president?
Well, in many respects, part of it was because Ukraine was looking at that period from Putin's point of view a bit more like a basket case. Because what Putin really doesn't want is Ukraine to succeed. And, under someone like, Trump, Trump was pretty much on the warpath about NATO as well. So it didn't really Trump isn't a transatlanticist. He wasn't really particularly, he wanted to push the other country members of NATO to pay more dues, sort of 2% of their GDP towards military. But you may recall that he was trying to leverage against that the withholding of Article 5 and the collective mutual defence of NATO. Trump didn't see much of a use for NATO, so Putin would be feeling quite confident that nothing was really going to happen on the NATO front with Ukraine. And Ukraine, was looking pretty unsuccessful. Look what happened on Trump's watch. You mentioned the impeachment trial. We saw Trump trying to privatize Ukraine and play with Ukraine, basically to get President Zelensky of Ukraine do him a favor, for getting involved in US domestic politics to open up, basically corruption investigations against Biden and his son. So Trump was messing about and playing with Ukraine. But Ukraine wasn't really looking like it was going to be much of a success story. What flipped later wasn't just the change, from Trump to Biden, but was Ukraine was looking like it was getting its act together. I think Putin thought that Zelensky was somebody he could manipulate. He was a former actor, a comedian. He's pretty young. He's a Russian speaker. He's Jewish. He's not a Ukrainian nationalist. They kept trying to actually call him a Ukrainian nationalist, but it's kind of interesting. And they thought that it could manipulate him. And then, he actually turns out to be more difficult than the Russians think to handle. And he's making, pretty much of a go of it, trying to clean up some of the corruption, although one could also say that's kind of infighting with oligarchs who are not in his orbit. But there's more investment coming into Russia, to Ukraine rather. The dependency on Russia is basically loosening. And I think Putin thinks Ukraine's getting away. And then Biden comes in.
They're slipping away from the
They're slipping
orbit.
away, they're moving away, the corruption's not working,
Okay.
You haven't got Zelensky doesn't prove to his guy, he can't, get a grip on him as he thought he could. And then Biden, the transatlanticist, comes in and tries to patch up together again all of the relations that have really got frayed under Trump with all of the NATO allies, and tries to kind of basically put it back together again. And then Ukrainians, try to sort of pick up where they had left off under Zelensky of, trying to have more outreach to NATO and Europe as well. And Putin sees that and thinks they're getting away.
Yeah, okay.
Why not January? I mean, America couldn't have done anything in January or February. Just couldn't move people quickly enough, or didn't see it coming?
You're thinking about the January of
2021.
2021?
I mean, America was in no position.
Well, I think that they were just kind of watching and waiting to see if we were just going to fall apart.
Yeah.
I mean, Putin also smells weakness on our part. He does think that we're very weak. He was anticipating that we'd just kind of fall apart, that we could be intimidated. I mean, unfortunately, for someone who wanted to see the end of NATO, he's probably given it, at least, for now, a bit of a shot in the arm and a temporary lease on life. I mean, we still need to think about the future of NATO and, what its mission is, but Putin's given it the old mission back again.
Okay, quick one more question from the audience, from Mike Feinstein. Let me put this to you, Heather, first. With right-wing media embracing authoritarians in Europe and Russia, will the bulk of Republican politicians and voters follow?
So that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so this keeps me up at night. Not dreaming of Putin, but rather dreaming of how this is going to play out. Because obviously, I'm watching this very closely, and I wrote. I'm a historian of the Republican Party. I know it well, and there's obviously been a split underway since at least January in the party. And the language right now is really interesting because, of course, this afternoon, former President Trump doubled down with the idea that Putin was clever and a peacemaker. And some of the personalities on the Fox News channel are echoing that kind of language. And yet, who knows? I mean, it looks as if in the House, the Freedom Caucus is standing with Trump. But certainly the institutionalists in the Senate are not. They are out in front talking about bipartisanship, coming together to stand against Putin. And that's why I asked the question about democracy, because that language of democracy has been something that the administration has been really heavy-handed about since the very beginning. If you look at the first speech by Anthony Blinken, and you look at one of the first speeches, I think it's the first speech by Biden at the State Department, it's democracy, 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 and we're going to protect it at home by protecting it overseas. And it hasn't really caught on in the popular speech that much. In the last 3 days, it's everywhere. And this, this could be, everything could be the moment things change, right? But this is, it seems to me to be a hard sell to come out and say openly, yes, we're going to side with the authoritarians. So I can't tell you how it's going to jump, but it's an interesting moment. It's one that came out of the blue for me, and I am very hopeful at watching how the language is falling down on that divide.
And as with a lot of issues with Trump and Trumpism, it may differ by chamber.
Certainly in Congress, yes, but Congress is going to react to what the people do. People always forget that. They really do what people do. And if the American people increasingly come out behind democracy, you can see places in which it looks as if the members of the Freedom Caucus are very nervous. There was an interview yesterday, I also lost track of time, with Marjorie Taylor Greene in which she sounded quite plaintive. There are signals that wing of the party, at least in terms of popular discourse, is getting weaker. At the same time, of course, in the state houses, the Republican-dominated state houses are essentially cutting off the right of people to vote, and you see this really dramatically right now in Texas. So how that's going to play out is a different story. But for me, changing the popular conversation is the first thing. And weirdly, like you say, not only has Vladimir Putin strengthened NATO, he has also strengthened the American commitment to the concept of democracy, which was a heavy lift, quite frankly, and he's made it a lot easier.
Yeah.
It's pretty hard to unite NATO, and he kind of did that too.
Well, I'd like to push both of you on a kind of question here about whether we actually have a firm understanding of what we think democracy means, because it gets to the question that you kind of posed to me. And I just wanted to put that out there because we recently had a statement from President Xi and President Putin on the margins of the Beijing Olympics. in which they talk about Russia and China as being democracies. So basically challenging the idea that we can even lay claim to what democracy is. And again, Putin created this idea of a managed democracy. So it's the political parties, it's the kind of the political system. It's not the essence of freedom and freedom of speech and assembly and the other things that our founding fathers would have particularly thought about. And I guess this is, the Tucker Carlsons and Marjorie Taylor Greens and, others that you're also kind of referring to about what they actually think democracy is.
Well, interestingly enough, that they are gripping to the degree they are to Viktor Orban.
Yeah.
His definition of democracy as illiberal democracy or Christian democracy. And I just have to say, you have to kind of admire illiberal democracy.
Yeah, it doesn't sound good, does it?
Like that was one out of George Orwell. But again, I think we are fighting with that definition. I always make an effort to define it as equality before the law and equality of access to resources, and that depends on an equal right to vote. But coming out with an actual definition of it and standing on it is something that I think we should probably be better about than.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're going to have to do. So, we'll be looking to you and, to others to put that out there in all seriousness. I think we're going to have to, basically lay claim to what we think it is. Yeah. As I said, the kind of grassroots participation, communities, groups like this, we're all part of democratic participation, making our voices heard, being able to have free discourse, because that's certainly not happening in Russia or in China now.
But you're right to raise the question. If I call up my cousin in Shanghai and he would say, let's look at the American franchise.
Yeah.
The access to vote, the ability to vote. And I see what's happening in name your state capital.
Exactly.
And this is what you're kind of representing here. It's a layup for Xi Jinping.
That's right.
And not just for Xi Jinping. I think having spent time in China, a lot of Chinese people, right, would raise that as well. Okay, we have to talk about the book because it's a great book. There is Nothing for You Here is the name of your new book, and this is language your father used for you to describe where you're from. We have heard Fiona Hill's analysis. Now we're going to learn a little bit about her as a person. It's a great story. So you come from the northeast England, Rust Belt place. Bishop Auckland is the name. Your father is a miner. Your mother is a nurse. So many vivid stories of you growing up in this place, very poor. So I'm going to ask you to tell two quick stories because they're so great. One of them is, how did you watch the royal wedding in 1973? Yeah. And why did they call you curtain legs?
So, the place that I grew up in the northeast of England was really hard hit by all of the transformations. It's basically like if you take yourselves back, some of you I can see here will take yourself back to Boston in the 70s and 80s and the surrounding area where all the heavy industry starts to go. Now, in the northeast of England, all of that heavy industry was nationalised industry. So this was it was like the Soviet Union, basically. And that was my first thought when I went from there to the Soviet Union to study in the 1980s. Well, this was just like home. Because after World War II, all the private investors and owners of coal fields and steelworks, they couldn't basically revitalise industry. And like in the United States, where the private sector was responsible for the post-World War II boom, the building up of the manufacturing, the kind of major corporations. In the UK, the government took over. And the whole of the northeast of England was heavy industry, so I barely knew anybody who worked in the private sector. Unless, they had a small plumbing business or worked in retail.
Otherwise, it was state-owned.
It was all state-owned. So when Margaret Thatcher came in 1979 and started the mass privatisation, my whole area, hundreds of thousands of people literally become unemployed overnight. And I went to university in 1984 on the back of the miners' strike. And it was really my father was saying to me then in 1984, there's nothing for you here, pet. You're going to have to go somewhere else to find it. Nobody's got a job. But in the 1970s, before basically the privatisation, all those big heavy industries were unprofitable. They were already running out of steam. In the 1960s, the mines started to close down. And my father had lost his job over and over again. Every job that he had, the mine would close, the next mine would close, and he worked at the steelworks closed, the brickworks, and eventually he gets a job as an orderly and ancillary worker in the hospital porter. And it's the very lowest rung of the economic ladder. I mean, it's not over the poverty line. It's kind of the working poor. And my parents wanted to buy a house. So they put everything into buying a house through a sort of a mutual assistance of building society. And they should not have bought this house because they couldn't really afford it. The house was empty pretty much inside. And half the time we couldn't keep the utility bills on. And we didn't have a television, and we had a radio, a little portable radio. And in 1973 in school, I was 7 or 8 years old, we were told at school we had to watch the royal wedding. Now, this wasn't Princess Diana and Prince Charles. This was Princess Anne, the Queen's daughter to her first husband, Captain Mark Phillips. I'm glad we didn't have to watch the second wedding a little bit later on. And we were told we had to, classic, school assignment, watch the royal wedding and write down and describe what we saw. Well, we didn't have a television. How could I watch the royal wedding? I can't watch it on the radio. And there were several other kids at school because it was a really poor area. Lots of people were unemployed and the jobs had gone, and we complained to the teacher. This teacher was pretty hard-nosed about it. Said, well, I suppose you'll fail. You have to be creative. So there was some neighbours across the road actually had not just a television, they had a colour television. And if I stood at just this right patch on some grass, I could see their television through the window. So I took the radio and I stood like this. I wasn't particularly tall then, and I watched the royal wedding through the window of the television. I hoped they wouldn't see me, listening to it on the radio and trying to memorise everything so I could describe the dress and Captain Mark Phillips in his uniform. And unfortunately, just as a kind of like it was getting to part of the main thing, they saw me and pulled the curtains closed. But I had enough to be able to go back and write up the assignment. And curtain legs was kind of part of it. My mum made all my clothes. That didn't come from thrift stores or hand me down from an older cousin. And my mother would go to one of these old department stores, and they'd have this sale of used material, and she would not just make clothes at the same time, she'd make the curtains, tablecloths, all kinds of things, big massive sewing. So of course my mother has this remnant from the local department store that's a bit like a Woolworths, that later closed down. There was Woolworths as well, went out of business. And she had just enough left over to make me a pair of basically trousers, pants. And this is the 1970s, and this was a really terrible looking piece of fabric. It was kind of, it looked like curtains. And then my mum decided to put like this tasseled fringe on the bottom of it. And they were kind of like slightly flared. And, I was like 10, and it's like awful. It's like middle school. And, everyone's going to pick on you anyway. And the same people who had the colour television across the way could, see the curtains hanging up. And then they see me with the things, even with the tassel. And of course, they knew it was the curtains and told everyone at school that I was wearing the curtains.
Oh,
so I was curtain legs for an entire year. Yeah, they were the bane of my life as a kid. Yeah, they had the colour television, and they could always sort of see what was going on in my house, curtains and everything else.
Oh, wow. So everyone here, your job is to email those neighbours now and say, this is what Fiona Hill has become.
Yeah, but I think we've all had that story of, the bad outfit, but yeah, that was, was not good.
But your story is, you come from this background, you're a brilliant student, you end up going to St. Andrews in Scotland, you come to Boston and you study at Harvard. And what's interesting just about your observation, which is also part of your historical analysis of the world, of the US, the Soviet Union at the time, and the UK, is you start to see this Rust Belt, Bishop Auckland everywhere.
Everywhere,
right? You mentioned Massachusetts.
Including here, when I got here, in 89.
And then you go and you study in Moscow and you start seeing it there. And as you think about it, this period seems to be a defining period that leads to where we are now.
That's right.
That is, you see these as the conditions for bringing populists to power and political polarization. Help us understand that. Maybe not so much here. Maybe we understand that a little better. Say in Soviet Union, Russia, Putin. Like, what are the commonalities here?
Well, and look, and Heather can speak to this as well, because your studies of the Republican Party about how it's shifted over, and the perceptions of parties here have changed as well. We saw the same pattern in the United Kingdom as here, where people in the UK started to think that the Labour Party had become like the Democratic Party in the United States, had become a party of an educated elite. So the leadership of Labour goes from being the old unions, because they've all been basically rolled back under Margaret Thatcher, and people who might start on the shop floor, as an auto worker or a coal miner, and work their way up through the party, but then starts to be somebody who's gone to Oxford or Cambridge and becomes a professional politician. Think Tony Blair, who was actually one of my local MPs, but couldn't have had a more different life than his constituents. And then brings in, educated elite. When I was at the Kennedy School in the working there in the 1990s, and when I got scholarship to Harvard, all the people that were on the same scholarship, as I sort of describe in the book, were the people that would go on to kind of basically rule Britain or be the major journalists and others, and were all on scholarships, and they were all from Oxford and Cambridge. I was the only kid who wasn't, and I was also from a comprehensive school, a kind of a regular school, and the only one from a working class background. And they were all ready, and they all went off at the end and joined Tony Blair's cabinet. And this led to a perception in the place where I grew up that the Labour Party had moved away. Mm-hmm. And in Russia, the Communist Party was seen to be, of course, incredibly corrupt. They had an elite, the Orwellian, some animals are more equal than others. And Putin wasn't part of the Communist Party. In fact, the speeches that he's made recently has been pretty critical, not just of Lenin, but of the whole kind of communist system. He's kind of restoring an earlier kind of period.
The deep state, as you write about.
Yeah, which is kind of ironic. And he sees himself as kind of a representative of every man, the hardscrabble kind of kid from the back streets. And he's kind of busted out of political parties entirely and saying, only I, the modern czar, can fix everything for you. You don't need political parties, they don't really represent you. Democracy is just really about who shouts the loudest and who has the most money. You don't need any of this. You just need, the authoritarian strongman. And there's been, interest in that in the UK as well. And then obviously, fast forward to the United States.
Yeah.
Can I ask this though? That
quickly, and then
I was going to say that you should say something about this because
we have a couple.
Heather,
I was going to ask. In the book, you identify that switch, and other people. Obviously, we all look at 1981 as the big year when wealth starts to
in both places.
Well, but to what do
UK and US?
So in America, we tend to look at the policies, the Reagan policies. And would you say the same? I mean, because you're looking at the deindustrialization of certain regions of the world.
Exactly.
Probably in part because the mines are worked out, probably in part because of changing global economies. But to what do you attribute that split that you start to notice in the 80s in Britain and in Moscow and even in the US?
Yeah, but there's a real kind of push to put the emphasis on the individual. And as you're kind of basically dismantling the heavy industry and moving towards automation, people are being pushed into, obviously sectors that really much more depend on higher levels of education, individual attainment, and they don't have to be rooted in a particular community. So the kind of the problem that many people, had here in the Boston area, if you're working in a mill town or you worked at an auto plant, you lived there as well, and your education was kind of tailored towards it. I mean, I had the same textbooks in my school that my grandparents had. Because the expectation was, maybe I might be a nurse or a teacher, but if I was a boy, I'd be going to work in a steelworks or a shipyard or in a coal mine. That you had a kind of the basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, but you weren't being, given any larger technical skills. The universities in the area there wasn't vocation. There was apprenticeships and vocational skills, but there wasn't an idea that anyone other than a very tiny percentage of kids, it was 5 or 6% when I went to university, would go to university and go off to some kind of white-collar profession. And if you think about the Soviet Union, the whole idea, this was the union of workers and peasants. So the idea you were going to be a worker or a peasant unless you were in the Communist Party and going through the hierarchy. And so much of the educational system in the United States as well was geared towards the workplace, the industries, of a particular area. And then when that shifts in the 80s, and again, modernization, automation, and the rise of the service sector and others, not everyone can shift along with it. And you get all of the person, what was the heartland becomes the Rust Belt, and an awful lot of people get stuck in place with the same educational system that doesn't move along with it either.
Okay, so quick advertisement for the book. I mean, you write about these Rust Belt observations and how they take us today. That's point one. Point two is, I get to break the news that all of you are going to get a signed copy of Fiona's book tonight. So stay for that. The book, of course, goes into your time in the Trump administration and you're testifying in the impeachment trial. We have to close, so the last question from the audience from Keith Stern is, as the January 6th committee continues to dig deep, and as the New York Attorney General does the same, will any of it make a difference? Heather.
Oh, is that for me?
Yeah.
Yes, because what they have is explosive. I don't think the New York stuff is going to matter as much simply because no one's going to see it. But if, in fact, they televise the January 6th committee, it's going to make a big difference. And if you don't believe me, look at the numbers of what happened to Nixon once they started televising. In the middle of the day, in the middle of the summer, the Watergate hearings, which were dull, frankly. They didn't really know how to do the big explosive news yet. And there were the wonderful moments, Barbara Jordan and all that, but there was a lot that just was not exciting. I think that the people in charge of if you just look at the way they've written those letters, which you can read, they're hitting all the highlights. I think those are going to be absolutely explosive, and I think they will make a real difference, at least in the way that Trump and his people have been perceived. Now, if you're asking, is he going to go to prison? Everybody always asks me that, and I always say no. Yeah. But he's also old and ill. What I anyway want is for that sort of behavior to be perceived once again as criminal and have that deter other people from stepping into the position that he was in. I'm not worried about him coming back, famous last words, that's it. Now he's going to become king of the universe, but I am worried about wannabe people like him. And I want to make sure that people understand that this is not the way that society should organize themselves. Right, and we have a lovely example right now in Russia.
Great. Well, we have to close. As I invite Margaret back up, please join me in thanking Fiona and Heather.
Is a well-deserved and effusive round of applause on it's a Tuesday night, a wet Tuesday night in February. I feel like, first of all, that was riveting. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Fiona. I feel like what we should do is just say, we'll be back tomorrow night and the next night and the next night, because really we want them to carry us through this whole, I think we may just have started something. Thank you so much. I just want to thank you two so much. It just is evidence, this night is evidence that really, that credible facts, interesting information, beautiful storytelling, the image of Fiona looking in that window, listening to the radio. By the way, the pictures are better on the radio. And your beautiful...
Yeah, that's true.
And your beautiful curtain legs. We can't wait to read the book. Thank you. I hope we will all see you again at the end of May. I'm going to do a little foreshadowing. We're doing Bright Nights, which is our spring gala, and I'm excited to reveal here for the very first time what the lineup is for that night, because we want to see you back. And I promise the weather's going to be better and the food is going to be plentiful, and we're going to sit at tables elbow to elbow, just like we've all been dreaming of for so long. So our guests for that late night, 3 nights in a row, the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize winner and journalist Maria Ressa is coming to BUR just for this occasion, all the way from the Philippines. Wow. She's going to talk about the threats to independent journalism, a subject close to our heart, those threats around the world, and her fight to quest to save it. Also, another night, Secretary John Kerry, the president's climate envoy, and his daughter, Dr. Vanessa Kerry. They're going to talk about their work to confronting 2 of the world's most pressing problems, climate change and global health. That will be an incredible evening. And the other night, Anita Hill and NPR's Nina Totenberg.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Together, 30 years after Nina Totenberg broke the story of Anita Hill and what her experience was with now Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. I was a production assistant at NPR at the time that she broke that story, and we'll be here to be with both of them. Plus, Every single evening, we'll have brilliant local artists starting the evening, kicking us off with surprise and delight. We hope you will be with us there. We hope you will be with us there. With that, it's a wrap. I'd like to give you, our Morrow Society members, your own round of applause. You deserve it. Thank you again for being with us tonight. Please stick around and say hello. Bump elbows with me and with one another. Given that I'm vaxxed, boosted, I got a negative PCR test today. I'd even love to shake your hand and say thank you to all of you close up. Thank you again, Heather, Scott, and Fiona Hill.